If you're enjoying this podcast or any podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon shop. You can tout your podcast pride while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. Make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com. Get your dragon swag on.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to this fun and exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, where we explore the interesting relationship between Shakespeare and J.R.R. Tolkien. Did Tolkien, just like George Bernard Shaw claimed to do, really hate Shakespeare and his works? Or were both men so influenced by Shakespeare and therefore too jealous to admit that they protested too much against the bard in order to duck comparisons to the great master whose shadow they feared to reside in? I think so. And in this episode, we will explore the reasons we have to believe that Tolkien owed much of his better inspirations to the works of Shakespeare, as well as a few other sources that must in all fairness be looked to. Shaw revealed his hand all too well while attempting to forge a name for himself in his late 30s as a theater critic for London's Saturday Review. Not surprisingly, during the 1890s, Shaw was called upon by the newspaper to review no fewer than 19 Shakespeare productions during his 3 or 4 year stint working for the publication. That's a lot of shows in several seasons, 19 different plays produced during the 1890s while he worked for the newspaper. But he famously wrote at the time, and I quote, "With the single exception of Homer, there is no eminent writer, not even Sir Walter Scott, whom I despise so entirely as I despise Shakespeare." And here's the best part. "When I measure my mind against his." Let me read that again. "With the single exception of Homer, there is no eminent writer, not even Sir Walter Scott, whom I despise so entirely as I despise Shakespeare when I measure my mind against his." When I measure my mind against his. Sounds like immense jealousy to me. And I think jealousy is the common theme found among most of the bard's more famous critics. I mean, let's be honest. To say Tolkien was not influenced by Shakespeare is to say Shakespeare was not influenced by Ovid. And imagine if we had writings from the great bard professing to abhor Ovid and his works, critical of the great author of Metamorphoses, and outright condemning that magnificent work. We would laugh at such a thing and have no choice but to question why the bard would condemn what is perhaps his greatest influence. Well, as I said before, methinks the Tolkien doth protest too much. Tolkien's creation of Middle-earth, a complete new world filled with new races, cultures, languages, and rich characters, has indeed been the inspiration for many who have come after him. The author, who also has a double RR in his name, of the Game of Thrones series comes to mind, and he himself has credited Tolkien for much of his inspiration, unlike the Tolkien who tries to deny those who inspired him. C.S. Lewis, who was a great friend of Tolkien, developed his world of Narnia about a decade after Tolkien first created Middle-earth with the original novel, The Hobbit. Indeed, the two men served as inspiration for each other, with Tolkien credited for sparking Luís to write his space trilogy, not quite as popular as well known as the Narnia series. And Luís created a leading character for that trilogy by the name of Elwyn Ransom as an homage to Tolkien, his dear friend. In fact, the two men used to meet together in fellowship, as it were, with other literary friends at a local tavern, much like how Aragorn first meets Frodo Baggins in The Lord of the Rings. Now, Tolkien had many historical and literary influences, obviously some personal influences, such as the tavern scene that we just mentioned. But they also included and were especially connected to Shakespeare's plays. Those allusions are not always distinct and obvious, and that's perhaps because Tolkien professed so often to hate the works of the bard. But nonetheless, they exist and they are there, and we'll talk about a few of them in just a moment. But just as Shakespeare did not conjure many of his characters and stories out of pure cloth, but instead based many of them on source works and real-life members of the Elizabethan court, so did Tolkien find ways to incorporate source works and real-life experiences into his tales of Middle-earth. Some of those sources include Dante's Divine Comedy, the Old English epic Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England, and both world wars. But of course, also the master, Shakespeare. Though Tolkien claimed to scorn the great bard, one thing he does have in common with those of us in the Quiller Nation is that he was an authorship skeptic. Yes, it's true, ladies and gentlemen. While serving as the secretary of the Debating Society at King Edward's School in Birmingham as a teenager, the future novelist wrote and delivered a scathing speech about the man from Stratford that was described later in the school newspaper as abuse upon Shakespeare, upon his filthy birthplace, his squalid surroundings, and his sordid character. The future creator of Middle-earth was in fact fully convinced that the works of Shakespeare were composed by Francis Bacon. He leaves that after his teenage years, and there's very little evidence of him returning to the quest for the truth about the author, instead choosing to attack Shakespeare whenever he had the chance throughout the remainder of most of his life. Now, it is possible that the young Tolkien first found his scorn for Shakespeare in the writings of Leo Tolstoy, whose famous essay on the works of the bard referred to Shakespeare's plays as trivial and positively bad. Tolstoy went on to describe Shakespeare as an insignificant, inartistic writer of immorality. Now, it's important to also note that the 1906 English translation of Tolstoy's critical essay includes a letter of support from none other than George Bernard Shaw. It's also important to note that Tolstoy's essay includes great condemnation of Shakespeare for two very specific reasons. And it's obvious to me that Tolkien would have read Tolstoy, read Shaw as a young man learning about literature and becoming eventually to become a literature professor himself. So, what do they study? They study those who've come before. And who were the greats? Well, obviously Shakespeare, but who were the up-and-coming greats right before Tolkien's age? Well, they were Tolstoy and Shaw, among others. But Tolstoy condemned Shakespeare for these two very specific reasons. First, it was Tolstoy's position that Shakespeare's springboard to greatness during the 18th century was advanced by German appreciation for his works. Indeed, the Germans have often tried to claim Shakespeare as one of their own, and later in history, even Adolf Hitler himself would claim that Shakespeare must have been a member of the master race. I know, crazy, but true. Not true that Shakespeare was a member of the master race, but true that Hitler claimed that he was. Of course, the greatest irony of that is we all know the man behind Shakespeare was actually a descendant of one of the great families of Normandy, and it will not be lost on students of history how exceptionally ironic that is when you factor in the importance of the Norman invasion of England and then coming full circle in history with the invasion of Normandy in 1944. But I digress. The other reason Tolstoy hated Shakespeare so much was based in what Tolstoy perceived as a disconnect between the writer and his works. Tolstoy was known for his immense personal connection to his characters and their stories, with some critics calling his works not works of art, but literally, and I quote, a piece of life. Many critics called him the world's conscience, a title that had once been reserved for the bard. Competition much? I don't know, maybe. Tolstoy also had a great disdain for the bard's depiction of the common man, servant characters, commoners in the stories and in the plays, finding it outright insulting that the Stratford man would depict his fellows with such contempt. Of course, another great irony there is that had Tolstoy understood who the true Shakespeare was, his understanding of the works would have improved, and his views about what he saw as condescension, not condensation, that would be very wet, condescension might have vastly changed. So you have Tolstoy who sees a disconnect. He figures out he's a smart man. He's a writer himself. He says, I don't like this guy because none of his characters, none of his stories fit his life. And so therefore it's not true. It has no depth. It has no integrity. And it's all drivel. Therefore, I am the better writer, the greater writer, because I write from experience. I write from life, and I personally connect to my characters and their stories. Isn't that ironic? But here is my favorite Tolstoy quote about Shakespeare, which he wrote at the age of 75 after rereading the complete works as an assessment of whether his opinion of the bard's works might have changed in him over time from a younger man when he first read them and studied them to now being an older man in the twilight of his life. And he wrote, I have felt with even greater force the same feelings. This time, however, not of bewilderment, but of firm, indubitable conviction that the unquestionable glory of a great genius, which Shakespeare enjoys and which compels writers of our time to imitate him and readers and spectators to discover in him non-existent merits, thereby distorting their aesthetic and ethical understanding, is a great evil, as is every untruth. Well, let's dissect that for a moment. It is a great evil, as is every untruth, to shower all of this praise and the mark of genius upon Shakespeare. A great evil, as is every untruth. Is he telling us more about his feelings regarding the Stratford myth rather than his feelings about the contents of the plays? I wonder. Nonetheless, with Tolstoy, once again, we find that the bard's greatest critics all had problems living within his shadow and felt outright judged by his works and, even more so, society's love for his works. Here we have great men of literary esteem who cannot shake the yoke of Shakespeare around their necks, and therefore must protest against him and profess their disdain for him and his writing. It's also important to note that Tolstoy was Russian and the Russians hated the Germans, and Tolstoy blamed the Germans for elevating Shakespeare to prominence, and so there's a little bit of that going on as well. It is difficult not to attribute some of Tolkien's feelings toward the bard as having been influenced by Tolstoy and Shaw, whose works he studied during his school days. It is also obvious that Tolkien had problems with Shakespeare authorship attribution, and therefore he saw the Stratford man as some sort of mythical false god. Well, duh. Of course, that makes total sense, doesn't it? Again, Tolstoy, brilliant man. Shaw, brilliant man. Tolkien, brilliant man. All of these men sensed a disconnect, a problem with the story. It didn't make sense to them. They didn't know how to make it correlate. And so they turned their vitriol against the man. I think more so the man than the writing. But let's explore further. Tolkien, who, like Tolstoy, understood the importance of finding the author's experience within his works, personal connections to characters and storylines, indeed the very autobiographical nature of great literature, was obviously dismayed by the absence of these within the Stratford narrative. It unsettled him from an early age, just as today it continues to unsettle anyone who approaches the works of Shakespeare with any form of intellectual honesty. But Tolkien took his skepticism and doubt to a different level, venting his outrage over the issue directly at the author and his works, rather than the establishment who continued to foist their mythology upon an unsuspecting populace. As a young man who had expressed his Shakespeare authorship skepticism in print and in speech before his peers, he was one of the earliest recipients of the intense backlash that has continued to plague skeptics for more than 100 years. His own student newspaper lambasted him for his position, and he quickly turned his criticism away from the Shakespeare narrative and onto the works themselves. It's a very important point. Here is Tolkien in his late teens, as a student of literature at the King Edward School, who is on the debate team and writes a speech and delivers it against the Stratford narrative, claiming that Sir Francis Bacon is the true author. He is immediately attacked by the establishment in print, in his own newspaper, by his own peers, and obviously, most likely, I'm sure, by the administration and the very educators who were supposed to be teaching him to analyze these works with an open and questioning mind, and of course, shut him down. So what does he do? He leaves that. He learns the lesson quick. Hot, don't touch. Ouch. And instead, he turns his direction toward attacking the works, not the man. Later in life, he did his best to disavow any and every connection that astute analysis found between his Middle-earth and the works of the bard. He took this to such a level that he once even expressed regret at referring to elves as a key race within Middle-earth. As he wrote to a friend and colleague in 1954, long after the Lord of the Rings series had been published. He wrote that while elves, quote, is a word in ancestry and original meaning suitable enough, the disastrous debasement of this word in which Shakespeare played an unforgivable part has really overloaded it with regrettable tones which are too much to overcome. Perhaps absolutely true. But doesn't that then admit that the bard usurped the word to such a degree as to have painted the most and best iconic version of elves ever created, and through only two distinct works where Shakespeare's elves can be found? A Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, and the more obscure and less prevalent appearance in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Both works of the bard present elves as whimsical, light-hearted creatures who live in enchanting woods, following the orders of magical and powerful elven kings and queens, doing their bidding and playing tricks on mortals. Tolkien did all he could to reverse the nature of elves, creating a more noble and darker class of being, higher in superiority over mortal men. But he still pays deference to the idea that they are ruled by a royal class of kings and queens, and that they still engage in mischievous, often deceptive practices upon mere mortal men. He would further write to an editor that the word elves in Middle-earth is to be understood in its ancient meanings, which continued as late as Spenser. A murrain on Will Shakespeare and his damned cobwebs. I love that one the most because when you think about the names of the elves in Midsummer Night's Dream, peas blossom, mustard seed, moth, and cobweb. Cobweb is the one that obviously tends to stand out in a certain way, but it's interesting that he chooses to pick on cobweb rather than peas blossom or mustard seed. Imagine if he wrote, to be understood in its ancient meanings, which continued as late as Spenser, a murrain on Will Shakespeare and his damned peas blossoms, or his damned mustard seeds. But no, he chose to pick on poor cobweb. Perhaps Tolkien's love-hate relationship with Shakespeare is actually more ambivalent than we have been led to believe over the years. As with most historical figures, and in fact with almost every historical writer ever, much of what we know about Tolkien, as I have already demonstrated and will continue to demonstrate, comes through letters, both written by him and to him. Go figure. Can anyone out there listening think of any famous writer throughout history who didn't leave behind even one letter? Is there any famous writer in history that we don't have a stack of letters written to him? Is there any famous writer in you see where I'm going? Astounding, isn't it? One such letter written by Tolkien was composed to his son Christopher. Tolkien wrote the letter after having attended a performance of Hamlet. Now you might ask yourself, why would a man who hates Shakespeare and the works of Shakespeare take the time to purchase a ticket and attend a performance of Hamlet and then write a letter to his son about the performance? Methinks the Tolkien doth protest too much. In the letter, Tolkien appears to take the long-held position that I also share, that you all know and have heard me say multiple times, which is that the works of Shakespeare were meant to be seen and not read. Though I do believe that the First Folio was created to preserve the works as literature for all posterity, and that in that form, they are meant to be works of literature to be read. I also believe that some of the versions of the plays in the First Folio were never actually performed before an audience. Some of the plays we see in print for the very first time in the First Folio, and it's possible that they were never performed at all. But many of them in their First Folio versions differ from quarto versions that we have that were published long before the folio. And those quarto versions were obviously the working script versions for production, whereas the folio appears to be a cleaned, edited, pristinely prepared version for all posterity. I also especially believe that about Hamlet. The 4.5-hour First Folio version, I don't believe, was ever performed for an audience prior to the folio being printed. Has it been used and performed since? Yes, sure, of course. And we don't know which textual version of Hamlet Tolkien went to see and watched before writing to his son, but nonetheless, the letter reads thus. It emphasized more strongly than anything I have ever seen the folly of reading Shakespeare and annotating him in the study, except as a concomitant except as a concomitant of seeing his plays acted. Let me start that again. It emphasized more strongly than anything I have ever seen the folly of reading Shakespeare and annotating him in the study, except as a concomitant of seeing his plays acted. It was a very good performance, with a young, rather fierce Hamlet. It was played fast, without cuts, and came out as a very exciting play. Could one only have seen it without ever having read it or knowing the plot, it would have been terrific. It was well produced, except for a bit of bungling over the killing of Polonius. But to my surprise, the part that came out as the most moving, almost intolerably so, was the one that in reading I always found a bore. The scene of mad Ophelia singing her snatches. Here is Tolkien begrudgingly admitting that it is the actor's live interpretation of the text that makes the text come to life and move the audience in a way he did not anticipate nor wishes to openly admit to. It's a beautiful bit of writing, as you would expect from the author of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, including use of words like concomitant, which is a new word for me, by the way. Here Tolkien shares with his son his personal experience at having watched what is perhaps one of the longest plays ever written, produced in such a way that it felt exciting to him, that it was fierce, that it was fast, and he wished that he could have seen it prior to ever having read it, so that he could enjoy it just as a play and not as a work of literature. Well, I get that. I totally understand that. But it does make you wonder how Tolkien would feel if someone were to say, the only reason to read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy is as a concomitant of seeing the Peter Jackson films. Let's go there for a moment. We can deduce from his essay on fairy stories that Tolkien once wrote and published. You can find it online, by the way, if you look for it. On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien, wherein he attacks drama as not belonging to literature or even as a branch of literature, calling it a distinct art and accusing it of being naturally hostile to fantasy. That's a direct quote. Fantasy, he wrote, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. He further wrote, to introduce, even with mechanical success, into this quasi-magical secondary world. Let me start that again. To introduce, even with mechanical success, into this quasi-magical secondary world, a further fantasy or magic is to demand, as it were, an inner or tertiary world. It is a world too much. To make such a thing may not be impossible. I have never seen it done with success. I have never seen it done with success. Perhaps he would have thought differently about CGI, but I kind of doubt it. Because at the root of his argument is the philosophy that nothing can replace the imagination sparked by the narrative tale, and that drama degrades fantasy by placing one person's interpretation above the imagination of another. So I can't help but think, and much to Peter Jackson's chagrin, I'm sure, Tolkien would have hated the Hobbit movies. He would have despised the Lord of the Rings trilogy because it became Peter Jackson's interpretation and the CGI artists' interpretations and the scenic designers and the costumers' interpretations of the narrative tale that he felt belonged to only the imagination of the individual reader. We can all relate to that, can't we? How many of us have seen a film version of a favorite novel and been absolutely incensed or outraged at Hollywood interpretations of our favorite characters and stories? It never matches what you see in your head. And if it does, it only does so to a certain level or degree. Tolkien understood this, obviously, wrote specifically about it and at length. And I encourage you to find the essay. And again, it's called On Fairy Stories. Look it up. It's a great read. I think you'll really enjoy it. He further wrote, "To be dissolved or to be degraded is the likely fate of fantasy when a dramatist tries to use it, even such a dramatist as Shakespeare." Unfortunately for Tolkien, by protesting against Shakespeare so much, he actually served to open the door to even greater comparisons between him and the bard in a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, a word I use here on purpose and not without some humor, I'm sure some of you will recognize. By denying Shakespeare's influence, Tolkien served to spark even deeper analysis of his works by those who have sought to make the connections between Middle-earth and Shakespeare, if only to prove him false about the greatness of Shakespeare. We'll get to the more obvious connections in a minute, but let's look at some that scholars over the years have pointed to as proof of Tolkien's, we'll call it borrowing from the bard throughout his novels. With some literary scholars going so far as to claim that Tolkien's obsession with denying the bard's influence is only further proof of his obsession with using the bard as a source. This guy was haunted by the ghost of Shakespeare, just as I claim and would say that Tolstoy's writings prove that he was haunted by the ghost of Shakespeare. Shaw was haunted by the ghost of Shakespeare, as so many have been over the centuries. One example is the comparisons made between Oberon of A Midsummer Night's Dream to Gandalf of The Hobbit. Powerful but benevolent guardians of lesser beings beneath them. Perhaps, and some have claimed, and I say this to students all the time, Prospero is the great-great-great-great-grandfather source of Gandalf. Both great wizards. Shakespeare did it first. Tolkien does it later. And you could say that J.K. Rowling takes it another step further with Dumbledore. Perhaps Oberon is the source of the Elven King. Certainly he is king of the fairies and shares a lot of qualities and has been depicted over the centuries, much like the Elven King is depicted in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Well, he appears in The Hobbit first slightly and then develops more fully in the Lord of the Rings. Are all of these characters somewhat interchangeable? And I would argue that, yes, I believe they are. Can the troll sequence in The Hobbit be compared to Puck when it comes to the trick played upon the trolls, the throwing of voices, to spark a quarrel amongst them the way that Puck does between Lysander and Demetrius in the forest of Athens? Puck takes on the voice and personas of the two men, pretending to be them, sounding like them, to urge them on to different locations so as to avoid the physical altercation and to tire them out. Tolkien takes it another level with the throwing of voices to cause the trolls to squabble and quarrel with each other so as to forget that the sun is rising, and thus they turn to stone. Or perhaps it was Ariel, who also throws his voice to mimic Trinculo in The Tempest to cause a quarrel between Trinculo and Caliban that Stefano then steps into the middle as well. Maybe that is what inspired the troll sequence in The Hobbit. Nonetheless, Shakespeare has used the mechanism twice before. And then Tolkien creatively borrows it. Is the shape-shifting of Bottom into a donkey the source of Bjorn shape-shifting into a bear in The Lord of the Rings? Or does that gain its providence from the talk of Oberon shape-shifting to entice and seduce the mortal women Titania is so jealous over? Now, perhaps these parallels can be seen merely as grasping at straws. But what about these others that I'm about to share? It cannot be denied that Great Birnam Wood marching to High Dunsinane Hill is indeed the source for Tolkien's Ents and the entire Ent race. He himself admitted such when he tore down Shakespeare's use of the Birnam Wood prophecy in an attempt to deflect away from the fact that he found his inspiration from the text of Macbeth. Tolkien claimed he suffered deep disappointment as a teen when he first read Macbeth and discovered the witch's prophecy of a marching wood was merely soldiers hiding beneath hewed branches of trees. He referred to it as, and I quote, the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of Great Birnam Wood to High Dunsinane Hill. And he said it was that profound disappointment, not Shakespeare inspiration, that led him to devise a setting in which the trees might really march to war, and then therefore the creation of Treebeard and the Ents. 6 of one, half a dozen of another. If it makes him feel better to trash the bard in order to explain away his feelings of inadequacy and nonetheless his obligation to Shakespeare for his ideas, then so be it. Whatever, J.R.R. Tolkien, whatever you want. If it makes you feel better, if you have to tear the guy down after you've stolen from him, you go right ahead. It doesn't take a deep reading of Henry IV Part 1, which obviously I have indulged in very deep readings of that play, creating edits and cuts to it in order to pair it with Henry IV Part 2 and turn it into one production and playing the title role on stage before an audience. But you don't have to do that to know the play well enough to then easily guess that Aragorn is the true heir to Gondor when you read the not-so-subtle riddle of Strider that we first find when we meet this so-called mysterious figure. Shakespeare penned, "All that glisters is not gold." That comes from The Merchant of Venice. Tolkien takes it almost word for word in the riddle of Strider. "All that is gold does not glitter." But the line here alludes to a verse from Henry IV Part 1, not just stealing the line from Merchant of Venice, but also the implication of the line where we find in Henry IV, Part 1, as Prince Hal says, "And like bright metal on a sullen ground, my reformation glittering o'er my fault." What is Hal saying? Hal, the true royal heir who has shirked his duties for the life of a vagabond in a tavern. Sound familiar? Strider. Interesting. A prince pretending to be a vagabond in a tavern. And where did Shakespeare get this famous line, by the way? Probably from Chaucer, who wrote in the Canterbury Tales, "But all thing which shineth as the gold nis not gold, as that I have heard it told." But Shakespeare never trashed Chaucer. He obviously didn't feel self-conscious of borrowing from the great writers who came before him. Tolkien had an ego weakness. But of course, the most glaring example of Shakespeare's influence on Tolkien comes from the elven prophecy regarding the Witch King. Not the witch's prophecy regarding the King Macbeth, but in fact, almost exactly reversed. And the highly climactic reveal during the battle between the Witch King and Éowyn. The Witch King borrows directly from a quote from King Lear. Lear says, "Come not between the dragon and his wrath." The Witch King of Angmar says, "Come not between the Nazgul and his prey." The elves' prophecy that the Witch King cannot fall by the hand of man comes straight out of Macbeth. The witches tell Macbeth, "None of woman born shall harm Macbeth," who is then lulled into a false sense of confidence until he faces Macduff and learns in the climactic moment that Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, not born, but delivered by C-section. Éowyn, the Rohan princess, disguises herself as a male soldier when the Witch King says to her, "No living man may hinder me." Éowyn dramatically removes her helmet and reveals, "But no living man am I. You look upon a woman." Boom! It's quite the moment. But it doesn't belong to Tolkien. It belongs to Shakespeare. There are plenty of other examples, including another nod to King Lear when Gandalf discusses the 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree, just like Lear's fool and his talk of the 7 stars, and so forth, and so on, and so on, and so forth. If you wish to learn more, you can always visit the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, edited by Michael Drout, that's spelled D-R-O-U-T. D-R-O-U-T, the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia. And it is filled with references to other lines, literary idioms, and writing styles that prove Tolkien was more influenced by Shakespeare than any other source. And so you see, Tolkien self-fulfilled his own prophecy. By denying Shakespeare, by forswearing him, by railing against him so much, he drew attention to the matter. And since so many scholars, countless scholars, have dove deep into Tolkien's works, and who do they find again and again, page after page, but William Shakespeare? And why shouldn't Tolkien have been influenced more by Shakespeare than any other writer? Can any English writer, or writer of English for that matter, ever ignore or refuse to acknowledge Shakespeare's influence on the language and the use of language to tell a story? The man invented more than 5,000 words, phrases, and idioms, which we all use, sometimes not even knowing that they should be credited to him. Sometimes we use them without even realizing it. Perhaps Tolkien was using Shakespeare many times without even realizing it because he was just such a part of him, his upbringing, his early studies, and his knowledge of literature. But we shouldn't be too hard on Tolkien for his protestations against the bard, or his attempted denials and refusals to acknowledge the influence he truly held over the creator of Middle-earth. As we have already pointed out, he was not alone among his peers in wanting to diminish the great bard in an effort to get out from within Shakespeare's shadow. That'd be a great title for a book. Shakespeare's Shadow. Have to look into that. Maybe it's a play. Maybe it's a play about Tolkien trying to get out from beneath. Maybe it's a play that features Tolkien, Tolstoy, and Shaw all squabbling and arguing about why Shakespeare sucks and trying to prove to the audience that Shakespeare's horrible and terrible. We'll call it Escaping Shakespeare's Shadow. I like it. I'm onto something. I'll get to work on that in all of my spare time. With many of these men, their outright despising of Shakespeare grew and grew as they got older, like a Salieri despising Mozart to the point of hatred. Here's another one we can add to the script. Voltaire. Look at poor Voltaire, who started off as a lover of Shakespeare when it first served to enable his own career. While exiled in Britain in the 1720s, Voltaire outright fell in love with the works of Shakespeare, which were still relatively new to the rest of Europe, believe it or not, at that time. New discovery, new exposure. Here's this man who discovers these works and immediately falls hopelessly in love with them, enamored with their tales. Voltaire saw that as an opportunity to borrow, we'll call it, from the bard's style and dramatic scenes when he eventually returned to France in 1728. And then he made a fast career over the next 20 years out of adapting Shakespearean works to French, including La Mort de César, based on Julius Caesar, which was published in 1731, Zaire, based on Othello in 1733, and his most famous, there are others, but his most famous is Semiramis, which was based on Hamlet in 1748. But when Shakespeare's works became more widely accessible and gained popularity throughout Europe, Voltaire suddenly turned against the bard, calling him a savage with only some imagination. He wrote in a letter to the lawyer Bernard Joseph Saurin in 1765, about 15 years after his big Semiramis based on Hamlet. Voltaire went on to say, and I quote, "He has written many happy lines, but his pieces can please only at London and in Canada. It is not a good sign for the taste of a nation when that which it admires meets with favor only at home." That's the French accent that I do that my wife hates, and she's probably listening to this right now, cringing. Except Shakespeare's works met with great favor in France, first through Voltaire's adaptations and then without Voltaire's assistance, and thus his vitriol increased further. And by 1770, 40 years after first using Shakespeare to catapult himself to stardom, Voltaire wrote, "France has not insults, fool's caps, and pillories enough for such a scoundrel. My blood boils in my own veins when I speak to you about him. And the terrible thing is that it is I myself who was the first to speak about this Shakespeare. I was the first who showed to the French a few pearls which I had found in his enormous dunghill." Okay, then. So the complete works of Shakespeare are nothing but an enormous dunghill, and it took Voltaire to dig through the shit to find a few pearls inside. All right, buddy, if you say so, if it makes you feel better. But as the bard once wrote, "Oh, beware, my lord of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. It is the walking ent which finds its roots in the writings of the greatest dramatist of all time. Green leaves, green boughs, and green with envy." Thanks for listening, fellow Quillers. And thank you all who have provided a rating and a review of the show at one of the many streaming platforms where we post our episodes. I can't tell you how much we value that and how important it is for us to be able to continue to share the podcast with our growing audience. Remember, you can also join our Patreon page for free or choose to support the show by becoming a Patreon patron. And you can get to that by clicking on the tab of the homepage of our website, or just visit patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. Patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. Be sure to join our email subscriber list as well to stay informed about future episodes and everything new about Don't Quill the Messenger. You can find all of that at our website, of course, don'tquillthepodcast.com. And send your emails to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Producer Jake and I love to hear from you. We do our best to respond to every email. Sometimes it takes us a little while. I know some of you have received emails from me as late as a month or two after first sending yours and then respond back with, "Wow, you actually did get back to me." Yes, I do. Yes, I will. So please go ahead and continue to send your comments, your requests, your suggestions. We love to have them. We love to see them. And more importantly, share your views with others about the podcast so that they too can become part of the Quiller Nation. And now, without any further ado, here is our very own Producer Jake to announce this month's Quiller of the Month for June 2024.
Thanks, Stephen, and hello, Quillers. 'Tis I, Jake Lloyd Bacon from Producerlandia, and I have the privilege and honor to name this month's Quiller of the Month. If you're not sure what this is, well, head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger to find out. Each and every month, all eligible patrons are entered into this monthly contest, the winner of which gets an item of their choosing from the shop, and, of course, the clout of your name etched in history of Quiller of the Month. Without further ado, I have loaded all of the eligible names up into our random wheel of names here, and the June 2024 Quiller of the Month is Jeanine Clark. Jeanine Clark. Congrats. Thank you for your support. Thanks to each and every one of you for continued support of this program. Jeanine, keep an eye on your email. We will send you an email on how to claim your winnings. Thanks again, everybody, for supporting the show. It really does mean the world to us, and it allows us to keep putting out the best possible podcast we can for you, all the Quillers out there. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for all you do for Dragon Wagon Radio and this show. We appreciate you immensely. And once more, thank you to you, Quiller Nation. I am so proud to be one of you. Until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.